Hello, my name is Marcelo Freitas and I am here defending the preservation of the text of the New Testament using the line of transmission of Family 35. In this video, we will explain whether Mark's final verses, which some call the long ending of Mark, are inspired. We are referring to verses 9 through 20 of chapter 16, the last chapter of the Gospel of Mark. First of all, we want to clarify that 99.9% of the manuscripts have these verses, including the Family 35. This means that only 0.1% of the Greek manuscripts do not have them. That is, the question is whether 1,700 manuscripts are correct or if 3 Greek manuscripts are correct. Codex Vaticanus, which is Codex B, Codex Sinaiticus, which is Codex Aleph, and GA 304. But the critics base their arguments only on the first two, since those are the old ones. GA 304 is from the 12th century, so only those two old manuscripts are going to receive our attention. As you already know, the fact that 99.9% of the Greek manuscripts have these verses, including the Family 35, is more than enough for us to conclude that these verses are inspired. Therefore, they are part of the Gospel of Mark. However, followers of the critical or eclectic text like Nassau and United Bible Society, the famous NU, feels that these verses may not be authentic. That is, the truth may be in two old manuscripts at the expense of 1,700 manuscripts. Their doubt is so strong that they use double brackets in the Nassau and United Bible Society Greek text, which means that they deny the authenticity of these verses. For us, this is truly absurd. However, their judgment dominates the theological seminaries. So let us clarify why we reject their arguments. But to explain why they question the truth, we need to clarify the eclectic methodology. However, this is a topic for another video. So let us just touch the arguments so that it is possible to understand what's going on. So then, in order to cast doubts on whether 99.9% of the evidence represents certainty, they use a methodology that contrasts with the methodology of the majority text, and they create a dichotomy. It is said that there are two possibilities for analyzing manuscripts. You can either count them or you can weigh them. Perhaps someone may think that counting manuscripts is something like 800 versus 200, or 400 versus 100, or who knows, 1,000 versus 200. In that case, the listener may conclude that the truth may not reside in merely counting manuscripts. After all, 800 manuscripts against 200 manuscripts may not be conclusive. When they talk about weighing, maybe someone thinks it is an objective procedure, since, after all, 3 pounds is objectively heavier than 2 pounds. So these may appear to be a better method. The problem is that the methodology used is totally subjective. It depends on the personal preferences of the textual critic. So for us, this dichotomy does not make sense. Manuscripts need to be counted as well as analyzed. In our view, weighing a manuscript would be inappropriate language. It is the readings that should be analyzed. But going back to the dichotomy used by the eclecticists, counting or weighing, if one thinks that weighing makes more sense, that weighing is the best option, then that's it. It is thereby possible to discard the 1,700 manuscripts and to choose the reading that appear in just 2 old manuscripts. For that, you only need to put more weight on the 2 old manuscripts. Before we discuss those 2 old manuscripts, let us clarify how subjective their way of weighing is. As we already said, the eclectic methodology will be covered in another video. But in order to understand the background, we need to touch on the subject. Since they say that the older ones should be preferred, this in itself already allows them to despite the 1,700 for being later, since their methodology tells us to give more weight to or to prefer shorter readings. Obviously, taking those 12 verses out is shorter. So one should prefer to take out those verses, since they say that the scribes wanted to make the manuscripts more smooth. The scribes would tend, in their opinion, to harmonize the text. So they deliberately, this is a declared methodology. They prefer to remove the harmony from the text, saying that the hard reading should be preferred over the easier reading. We remind the listener that the New Testament in harmony will always be the easier reading. In other words, everything that one should prefer has to do with the personal preferences of the textual critic, the editor. It is all subjective. But what are the 2 old manuscripts that we are talking about? Which 2 old manuscripts would be heavier than the 1,700 combined? We are talking about Codex B, the famous Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Aleph, the Sinaiticus. The critics like those 2 manuscripts to the point of depreciating 1,700 others. The best manuscript for the eclecticists would be Codex Vaticanus. This codex was adopted by Hort of the WH duo. This codex does in fact omit the 12 verses. However, the copyist that produced this manuscript left a completely blank column. It is the only blank column in the entire New Testament. Not only that, there is some blank space at the end of the column before it. The total space available will hold the missing 12 verses. It is easy to show that this is true. Let's take these 12 verses from the Greek text of Family 35 and put them in the available space. But we can also recognize a symbolic value of the scribe having left a blank column. Perhaps he was obeying an order to omit the verses, but left a silent protest. In that case, his exemplar had the verses. As for the Sinaitic Codex, it also has a problem at the end of Mark, a falsification. In this case, unlike the Vaticanus, a more technical analysis of the manuscript is necessary because we have to count the words and the lines, which is beyond the purpose of this video to demonstrate. So I just reproduced the arguments. This falsification was seen by Tischendorf himself, the man who discovered the manuscript, and Dr. Pickering has also verified it. The details we will put in our book. Now, for the superficial explanation, a fold sheet containing 4 pages was removed from the manuscript and a different sheet was inserted. This means that there are 2 hands at this point of the manuscript in the codex, and the second hand includes precisely the end of Mark. The second point is that the copyist increased the space between the letters so as not to leave a blank column at the end of Mark, as it is in Codex B. If the normal size and spacing between the letters had been kept, there would be space for the last 12 verses of Mark, since the first hand probably did have these verses. We will put the counting detail in our book. To sum up, we repeat that in addition to have 99.9% of the Greek manuscripts, 1,700 manuscripts against 0.1% of the manuscripts, represented by 2 old manuscripts. One of them, that is Codex Vaticanus, has an empty column in it that could hold the end of Mark, and the other, the Sinaitic, has a falsification. But there is another argument that favors the removal of these verses. For some scholars, the business of catching snakes or drinking poison that is recorded in the end of Mark is kind of strange. Dr. Pickering actually heard a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary say it is better to get rid of these verses. In summary, we have tried to show that these 2 codex used to claim that the omission exists, that they call the best, do not deserve to have this weight, and that concluding the gospel in verse 8 would be very strange. But let it be clear here that our position is objective. Whether our interpretation of these verses is correct, whether or not we like those verses, is an irrelevant consideration. We repeat, for us, the simple fact that 99.9% of the Greek manuscripts, representing 1,700 manuscripts, including the best line of transmission, which is Family 35, have these verses, already constitutes clear, forceful proof to allow us to objectively affirm that these verses are inspired and are part of the Gospel of Mark. With that, we clarify that in addition of having 99.9% against 0.1% of the manuscripts, one of the manuscript, Codex Vaticanus, has an empty column in it in that place, and the other, Codex Aleph, Dr. Pickering claims to be a forgery, as Tischendorf himself recognized. So the question remains, why is doubt still a reality in theological seminaries? Perhaps it is because no one wants to say that the oldest manuscripts are the worst. These would not be acceptable in the scholastic world. God has preserved His text. Thank you, and until the next video.